All right. Well, I'm obviously talking about the two boathouses, the two boat liveries in Minocqua. And I had an interesting question before this topic is why were there only two since we are on an island and lots of shoreline? And I would say, and maybe I should even preface that comment with what is a boat livery? Because you may not be familiar with that term. And it's similar to a stable on land. People in town didn't own horses, for example. And most people, if they weren't farmers, they lived in town. They didn't have horses, and they frequently either needed a ride somewhere, and so a livery stable provided something similar to a taxi um, with a horse and buggy or a stage. You know, horse and buggy was like a taxi. The stage was like a bus. Um, Similarly, a boat livery rented boats. That was how they started out. They rented boats, sold bait for fishing, and is for people who didn't have their own boats but wanted to go fishing. So that's what boat liveries did. It was the water version of a livery stable on land. So why do we have only two of them in Minocqua? Because these two really go back to the turn of the century, turn of 1900. And why were there only two? And I had never thought about that question, but I think my answer is we only had two suitable places on the island for them to operate. You think of where Bosacki's is and where the Thirsty Whale is. In both places, the shoreline is gradual down to the water. So it's easy to have that type of operation there. Nearly everywhere else around the island, we've got a steep bank or a high bank. And that wasn't conducive to having a boat livery. So I think that's the reason why we have only two of them. So we're first going to look at Thirsty Whale. If I were doing it in order, I'd first look at Bosacki's boathouse because Bosacki's, that operation, that boat livery, predated the yacht club, or rather Thirsty Whale. But I thought that more people would have greater interest in Bosacki's, so I wanted to save that for a second. So this is the list of places that are business names that have operated where the Thirsty Whale is. It shows when they started, and Thirsty Whale has been in existence there under that name, certainly not under the same owners. They've been in business there since 1974. So where Thirsty Whale is, this is a picture taken in about 1895. And this arrow shows where on the west shore of the Minocqua Island Thirsty Whale is located now, where the boat livery would be located starting in 1902. And zeroing in on that, there's the flat area down to the shore, and that's why they chose that area. There is an interesting building here of historical interest behind it. It's called the Lakeview House. That was one of the first buildings built on the Minocqua town site, on the platted village of Minocqua. And according to the old timers who talked about Minocqua's beginnings, and I'm saying back in the 1920s, 1930s, they talked about it, they said that the Lakeview House was built even before the lots were sold in Minocqua. And it was built by Frank Reamer. I don't know what kind of assurances he had from the town site owners that he was going to be able to buy that lot. But presumably, or reportedly, he did build his Lakeview House. It was a hotel, a resort hotel, before the town lots went on sale. And it looks to me like this porch that he has in front of it goes right to the edge of the bank here. And of course, there's an illustration of a high bank. And it crosses what is now Park Avenue, West Park Avenue. But people in those early days didn't worry about things like that, and he just built his porch right out to the bank over Park Avenue. So this is a picture in about 1904 of, this is the earliest picture that I've seen of the boathouse that Hoover and McMillan. So it was built by Richard Hoover and Hugh McMillan in 1902. They started out just with this, I don't know which one, I can't say whether they started out with this part of it or this part, but they started out with one building. And from 1902 on, for the next 12 years or so, they added at least one building every year. It became a big, you'll see it in the pictures, it became a big conglomeration of buildings. They added on and added docks. And in this picture in 1904, you can see that that Lakeview house has actually been moved. It originally was over here, but by 1904, the building was moved. It was moved off Park Avenue and moved over here. And it's just one of the many buildings that were moved in Minocqua, and it's a pretty good sized one. And I've many of my talks have involved buildings, talking about buildings in Minocqua that have been moved. This was one of the first ones to be moved like that. By 1904, Hoover and McMillan were calling their boat livery, and here it is in 1908. They were calling it Pleasant View Boat Livery, although it frequently was still called Hoover and McMillan. This shows another boathouse. This is the Sutton boathouse. John Sutton built that. It really wasn't a commercial boat livery operation like either Thirsty Whale or Bosacki's. Little closer view. So here you can see there were the original two buildings. This one here, then an addition there, then this building over the docks. Initially there was just docks over this, then they put the building over it, and then there are actually two buildings back here. So this is between 1902 and 1908, all those buildings were built. This is head on from the lake about the same time, about 1908. Now in 1904, Richard Hoover married Karen Winger. She was a widow. Her husband had been Ole Winger. He died in 1898. They had two children, two sons, and Richard Hoover married her in 1904. And at that time, in 1904, Richard Hoover bought out his partner, McMillan, and then he gave a partnership share to his stepson, Albert Winger, who was 18. That actually happened in 1905. And so then it became known as the Hoover and Winger Boat Livery, or Pleasant View. They really used both names. But I would say Hoover and Winger was used more often than Pleasant View. This postcard says Pleasant View. Now, at this time in 1908, the Hoover family, Hoover and his wife, Karen Winger, lived in this was a residence here. And they lived there in the summers, or from late spring through into mid-fall. They lived in that residence. Here's a view looking at about the same time, 1908, looking from the shoreline on the north side of the boathouse. It's looking from about where the public dock is now, and boat landing. Now this is a little later, 1911. Now we've got even more additions. We've got this added on here and another addition here. And this is looking at it from the south side in about 1911. And by that time, they had purchased they had it built, a houseboat. It was built by Mapes and Rummery Boat Works here in Minocqua in 1910. And this was a popular thing. The predecessor of Bosacki's, Josart, also had houseboats for rent. And they would either rent them out with a cook, that was most common, and you'd take that houseboat out on the lake and stay in it somewhere on the chain with a cook and do your fishing. So this is the one that Hoover had. Now in September of 1911, Richard Hoover was shot by his stepson, Albert Winger. Richard Hoover, and what the circumstances of it are indicate that Richard had quite a temper. But interestingly, he was a very popular guy in Minocqua and Arborvita because he worked for Yawkey Bissell Company in Arborvita in the winter. He was their train master. And in the summer, when they weren't logging up there, then he was operating his boathouse. Well, according to the story that came out at the inquest and in the trial, what happened was that Albert and his younger brother Edwin were eating dinner with their mom, and Mr. Hoover came in and was mad about something, started throwing dishes around, and he struck Albert several times, and Albert fell to the floor. And when Hoover was going to strike him again, Mrs. Hoover ran to protect her son, and she was hit several times. And then Hoover said he was going to get a gun and, quote, clean out the whole Norwegian family. So Hoover asked where his revolver was and went into his office, presumably to get his gun. Albert ran to his boat and retrieved a rifle that he had in his boat. It was reported variably that it was a .22 caliber rifle or a .32 caliber rifle, not certain which. So Albert came back into the kitchen where Hoover, with his rifle, and Hoover rushed at him, and Albert thought Hoover had his revolver, and certainly was, based on what had been happening, was afraid of what was going to happen. So he shot, and the bullet struck Hoover in the lower jaw, and the bullet went through his carotid artery and lodged in his spine, and he died very quickly. And so that happened on September 20, 1911. There was a coroner's inquest in Rhinelander the next day, and the trial was scheduled for two weeks later. Things happened quickly in those days. That wasn't unusual. I mean, there was fast justice. I mean, nowadays, if there were an incident like that, the trial would take place a year and a half or 2 years later, which I don't think is very good. But, and maybe 2 weeks isn't very good either. They should have had more time to prepare, perhaps. But yeah, the trial started exactly 2 weeks after the shooting. And Winger was represented by Henry Ames. That would be Bud Ames' grandfather, for those of you who remember Bud Ames. And he had a second attorney from Merrill named Van Heck. So the trials took 2.5 days, and at the end after the trial, the jury deliberated for 17 hours, and he was acquitted of the murder. He was acquitted on the basis of it being self-defense. And so after that, Albert Winger and his mother were the owners of the boathouse, and they operated it together. After that shooting, they definitely dumped the name Hoover, and it was no longer the Hoover and Winger boathouse. Now this postcard says Winger Brothers, and now that would tip me off to it probably the date being wrong. I should date this more like 1924 or so. And the reason is, and I said they dumped the name, they were calling it Pleasant View Boat Livery then all the time, which it was not a new name. It had that name since 1904. But after the shooting in 1911, it was named exclusively called Pleasant View Boat Livery. Well, Karen Hoover died. Karen Hoover, the Albert's mother, died in April 1921, after which Albert owned the boathouse, but he brought his brother Edwin in as an owner, and the two of them operated together, and that's where this Winger Brothers comes from. And so I missed that, and that would tip me off that this picture was taken after Karen Hoover died in April of 1921. Here's an interesting aerial photograph, 1928, of the Pleasant View boat livery. You can see the conglomeration of buildings here. There really were a lot there. I think there are like 12 buildings in this because there was the original one here, and then the second one here, and then in addition to that front one, an addition there, and then this, and then there were two buildings back here. Oh, sorry, I'm going ahead too far. Oh, now I lost my red marks. There's a building back there, the second big building here, then this one, and then that one. There was like 12. So it really was quite a conglomeration. And by this time in 1928, there was a town dock here and a boat landing. No parking, interestingly. You drove in, no parking for it. But there was no parking at Pleasant View either. You just had to park on the street, apparently. This is a view from the railroad trestle. About that same time, about 1928. So back up in my notes, let's see. In 1928, the Pleasant View boat livery was sold to Ralph Garrison. This is an ad for it, showing Ralph Garrison as the owner. Then in 1930, it was sold to Tony Bosacki, or Anthony Bosacki. He was Theodore Bosacki's brother, and he bought the Pleasant View boathouse in 1930 and changed its name to Town Dock Boathouse, and he opened an ice cream and candy shop. And interestingly, prior to 1930, he had been operating the candy shop at Bosacki's. And he decided to go off on his own. He was involved actually as reportedly a partner with Theodore for a couple of years, but he left that partnership in 1930. It was only a couple of years. And he left it in 1930 and purchased the Pleasant View boat livery. Now Clarence Bassett, moved into that boat livery and to operate Bassett's Marine Service. And that arrangement lasted for 2 years. Interestingly, in 1931, Tony Bosacki was no longer operating a candy shop, just an ice cream shop in the Town Dock Boathouse. Now, there was nothing in the paper to explain that, but I can read into it that perhaps his brother, Theodore, objected to him walking off with the Bosacki candy recipes and using them at the Town Dock Boathouse. And his brother, in one way or another, Theodore, convinced Anthony that he can't make candies at the Town Dock Boathouse using the Bosacki candy recipes. So starting in 31, Anthony had just an ice cream parlor. I don't know if either Bosacki descendants know anything about that. Can you shed any light on that?
Not for me at the moment.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, it is. Well, let's see. So Anthony Bosacki ownership lasted only for 2 years. And then in 1932, Louis Newville and Jake Kunz purchased the Town Dock Boathouse. And they hired a couple managers in 32 and 33 to manage the place. In 33, there was a restaurant operated in it called Cole Gardens. But in 34, they sold it to Gus Nolan. And Gus Nolan was the owner of the Northern Resort across the lake. So he purchased it, kept the name Town Dock Boathouse. He didn't operate a restaurant in it. He had an ice cream parlor and served soft drinks and beer. And as this ad shows, he did have entertainment there, floor show and orchestra. After or beginning in 1935, there was a hole in the record. From 35 to 47, there isn't a single mention of this boathouse and not a single ad for it in the Lakeland Times or Minocqua Times, which is crazy or curious because prior to that, it appears all the time in the paper, either in articles or in ads. So I suspect that possibly during that time, it was kind of dormant and nobody was operating it. And then in 1947, or January of 1948, Karl Heinrich obtained or petitioned the town board in January of 48 to transfer a liquor license to it. And that was another indication that it hadn't been operating, because he had to petition to have a license transferred from another location to this boathouse. And the town board approved that. And the reporting was that during the winter of 47-48, Karl Heinrich tore down parts of the old boathouse and remodeled other parts. The Lakeland Times wrote on April 22, the old structure has been almost completely torn down and rebuilt. And then the new building featured a restaurant overlooking the lake. And so what we have now he created mostly what we have now at the yacht club. That's how it changed from what this appears in 1940 approximately to what we have now. Karl Heinrich did that in 47 and 48. And then in May of 48, well, here he advertised the opening of it that spring. And after this, or during this time in May, he sold the Whispering Pines Yacht Club, and that's how the name it had. Whispering Pines Yacht Club was changed from Town Dock Boathouse. He sold it to Curtis Fleeman, F-L-I-E-M-A-N. Sold it to Curtis Fleeman, who was operating it. And Curtis received the liquor license from the town. And then on June 1st, just 2 weeks, 3 weeks after it opened, it nearly burned down. It was heavily damaged in a fire. And it was rebuilt, but it did gut the building. Now this is an aerial photo. This is what it looked like in about 1949. And at that time, at the time of that aerial photo, in the winter of 49-50, there was a controversy before the town board. There were a lot of people objecting to the noise and after-hours operation of the Whispering Pines Yacht Club. And in May of 1950, the town revoked his liquor license, and they issued it to Clarence Bassett instead. And Clarence Bassett must have bought the place, probably got a good price since Fleeman no longer had a liquor license, and Clarence Bassett was able to get her liquor license. So Clarence Bassett bought the property and changed the name to Bassett's Marine Bar and Dining Room. It was formerly Whispering Pines. So that was June 1, 1950. That's when he opened. He operated it through the 50s, but then in December of 56, he sold it to Joe Ritchie. Joe and Ruth Ritchie. They continued using the name, though, in 57. They opened in May 4th in 57 under new ownership, Joe and Ruth Ritchie, but they continued using the name Bassett's Marine Bar. And they used it for the rest of that year. Because here's the ad about them closing, which, you know, they're closing. Bosacki's closed in the winters. Nearly every place up here closed in the winters, and that was the case until the early 70s. It was really snowmobiling that changed that. In the early 70s, snowmobiling started to get popular, and restaurants and bars started, and resorts started keeping open through the winter. So it appears that probably after 1 year of operating as Bassett's Marine Bar, that Joe Ritchie then changed the name to Joe's Marine Bar, and he was popular for the Moscow Mule Club. And I just thought of a picture that I forgot to include in this. I have a picture of Joe Ritchie behind the bar with all those I don't know if they were stainless steel, they were silver metal mugs hanging from the ceiling above him. So this is from 1972. Rather good price for mixed drinks. So in 1972, new owners applied for a liquor license for Joe's Marine Bar. He was selling it. And the new owner was Gary Spiel. And he applied for a liquor license under the corporate name Thirsty Whale Inc. And they must have taken over in May, because we have this ad that ran May 25th for a grand opening for Joe's Marine Bar, celebrate with Gary and Jan Spiel. They continued using the name Joe's Marine Bar. They didn't change it to Yacht Club, even though their corporation was named Yacht Club Inc. They continued using Joe's Marine Bar for a couple years, even into the fall of 73. They're still using Joe's Marine Bar. They advertised the Hog Fest event. It's first annual. That might have been the last annual one too. I never heard of it. They should have advertised first and last annual Hog Fest. And the week after the Hog Fest, Dan's Gay 90s ran this congratulatory ad that congratulating Gary and Jan Spiel of Joe's Marine Bar for doing the Hog Fest. Now in 74, when they applied for their liquor license, they named in the liquor license application, they named the bar the Thirsty Whale, not Joe's Marine Bar. So that would indicate in 74 they did start using the name Thirsty Whale. I looked through the newspapers of 74 hoping to find an ad that confirmed that they ran an ad for the Thirsty Whale. There was not a single ad run in 74. So I'm still only supposing that they did change their name at that point. So this is a picture of the Thirsty Whale in March of 94. Much the way it appears today. That's the end of the Thirsty Whale part. So now we go to Bosacki's. And here's the list of the businesses that have run in that location. It started with Louis, what was Neff's first name? Let me refresh my memory. It's Louis Weishar. William Neff and Louis Weishar started a boat livery and bait business, a boat rental and bait business on the shore where Bosacki's is now, in 1889. Although that year is uncertain, there was no record. The Lakeland Times or Minocqua Times didn't begin publication until 1891. And Neff and Weishar had been in business for at least a couple of years at that time. But whether they started in 88 or 89 is uncertain. Kathy Bosacki will remember this. Because I remember a sign being up in the bar in, I think, the late 1990s that I think came from Kathy Bosacki. She wanted to correct the way people were pronouncing their name. And we ought to get it right. It's Bosackis, not Bosackis. And it seemed that people from Chicago and Milwaukee in particular had predilection to pronouncing it Bosackis. I know people in my family did. I think it's a German influence in Milwaukee and Chicago, the way you pronounce an A. So it was very common and still is. I was just talking to somebody last week. Oh, you're going to talk about Bosackis. No, let me correct you. It's Bosackis I'm going to talk about. And so that's why we have this. There was a sign up there. My wife did the best she could to reproduce the Bosackis sign that they had up in the bar. So this was the ad that was in the first issue of the Minocqua Times for the Neff and Weishar for their boat rentals. And they also sold bait. Now, I don't have certainly not any picture of the shoreline here before the Neff and Weishar. This is really the earliest photo of the shoreline of Minocqua that I have ever seen. There are a couple earlier pictures taken in town on Main Street, but nothing of the shoreline like this. And you can tell, in 1899, it still was pretty sparsely built. And this is kind of interesting. Here is the schoolhouse. When that schoolhouse was, and that's a schoolhouse that was built in 1894 and added on to in 1900. When that schoolhouse, no, I'm sorry, the original schoolhouse was built in 1889. This was 94 and 1900 in this picture. But when the original schoolhouse was built out there, this was even less built up. And the comments from the people were, why are we building the schoolhouse so far out in the country? This is the Jack Sutton residence that until the Catholic priest built what's now the Heritage House, that was the largest residence in town. But then the Catholic priest outdid him. So here, where the arrow is, shows the first building, the first boathouse that later became Bosacki's. This was built by Neff and Weishar in 1894. This was the first building they built. In 1895, behind it here, where this residence is, that's the David Josart residence. That was built in 1895. Then in 1896, Dave Josart purchased Neff's partnership interest in the boathouse and boat livery business. So at that point, it became Josart and Weishar. And then in 1901, Josart bought out Weishar, and it became the Dave Josart Boat Livery. So by the time of this photo in 1903, this was Josart's. So here his residence is. Now that lineup, the alignment of this photo makes it look like Dave Josart's residence is immediately behind the boathouse, but it's really off to the side. You know, what's behind the boathouse is this line, and the Josart residence is that line to the north of the boathouse. So then in 1904, Josart added an extra, built an addition on the south side of his boathouse, and that's shown here, the original building there, the addition here. And then in 1906, he added another addition on the north side, which is shown here. So that was the first addition on this side, and the second addition here, and ended up being a U-shaped. So at the time of this first photo in 1907, the Colby called it Dave Josart's Boat Livery. I believe this is about the same vintage photo, about 1907, but this one was called D. Josart, well, Josart misspelled, and Sons boat livery. So about 1907, Dave Josart brought at least one of his sons in. Most times that the Josart and Son name was shown, it was a singular son, not sons plural. It was always shown as Josart and Son boat livery. And he had two possible sons who could have been involved. Could have been Harry or could have been Daniel. No, I never read or heard which son he had included in the Josart and Son boat livery. This is in 1905. Let me check when. No, this is in 1904. Josart purchased a 30-foot launch, a motor launch, from the Rhinelander Boat Company and called it Minocqua. This motor launch continued with Bosacki's at least into the 1950s. And we'll see in some later pictures or ads where they're advertising in the 1950s. Bosacki's was advertising excursions on the lake in the launch called Minocqua. This particular picture is in that era of 1905 to 1910, and that's Dave Josart here. The last time I showed this picture actually was at the last talk when I talked about the earliest buildings in town, because this was one of them. That's the Smack residence, Charles Smack. And at the time I showed this, I didn't know that was Dave Josart in that picture. But I just, in researching this, I came across a photo where a very old timer produced this photo and said, that's Dave Josart in the photo. I don't know who these people are. There's a fishing guide, but it's at Josart's, and it's their catch of fish, not muskies. People didn't fish just for muskies back then. And this is an interesting picture of a group of people going out boating. Look how they're dressed. They've got their sunbonnets on, but no life preservers. And it's a safe bet that few or none of them knew how to swim. And that was a problem, because in many boating accidents up here, back in those days, in the early 1900s, people drowned, especially women, because they would go dressed in these heavy clothes. And women in particular did not know how to swim, never had the opportunity to learn. Boys were more likely to learn that in their childhood. And people died if they went overboard, if the boat capsized, it frequently led to a drowning. So here's a picture looking from the south toward about 1910 towards the boathouse. So here's the version of the boathouse more people are familiar with. This is the later version, starting in 1912. So in 1911, Josart sold the boathouse to A.J. Klum and E.A. Petter. They both worked for the railroad and didn't live here. They bought the boathouse, and then in the winter of 11-12, a year after they bought it, they built this addition. It's 112 feet wide, 41 feet deep, the big arched roof. And that created the look that it retained until it burned down in 1972. So this was the landmark on Lake Minocqua, beginning in 1912. Now at that, unfortunately for Klum and Petter, and maybe because outsiders bought the boathouse, in 1912, the town board decided it wasn't going to issue liquor licenses to the boathouses, and that applied to both. They wouldn't issue a liquor license to Klum and Petter, and they didn't issue a liquor license to Hoover and Winger. Well, in 1912, Hoover was deceased. They wouldn't issue it to Winger. So in 1912, Klum and Petter shut down the much of the operation of the boathouse. They did keep their machine shop open, but the boathouse was largely closed. So in 1913, they brought Dave Josart back into the ownership of the boathouse, I suspect, as a way of getting a local person involved again and convincing the town board to issue a liquor license. The town board still did not issue a liquor license, so that wasn't successful. So then in 1914, the following year, they sold the boathouse to Carl Rubeski. And he opened that year, he ran it, but he still didn't have a liquor license. The town did finally relent in 1916, and it issued a liquor license to both boathouses in 1916. So this is what things looked like in 1920. In 1914, Earl Schilling opened an ice cream parlor in the boathouse. Now, it seems like he only operated it for 1 year. There was no, after 1914, there was no mention of it in the paper, no mention of any ice cream parlor in the boathouse. Not until 1919, when Theodore Bosacki opened an ice cream parlor in the boathouse. And then in 1922, Bosacki expanded his ice cream parlor to include candy, and it was then called the Bosacki's Sweet Shop. And he sold ice cream and Bosacki homemade candy. Sometime after 1914, and the date of this was uncertain, Rubeski sold the boathouse to a man named Glennon, Glennan. He then sold it in January of 1918 to Richard Wasserberger, who was a Minocqua resident. And after that, it was called Wasserberger's Garage and Boat Livery, starting in 1918. And the garage portion of it came from the fact that Clement Petter had started a machine shop at the rear of the boathouse. I call it the rear. I think the front of the boathouse, from the terms I use, the front of the boathouse faces the lake, the rear faces the parking lot. But you could look at it the reverse way, I suppose, too. Here's a nice aerial photograph of it. The machine shop part of the building was here originally. The sweet shop was here. Well, let's see, and check my notes if there was something else I wanted to include in that. So in 1920, I mentioned that Theodore Bosacki's brother, Anthony, was involved in Bosacki's. And that began in 1928, that Anthony joined him in the boathouse business. And they actually, at that point, were called Bosacki Brothers. And that year, in 1928, they added a restaurant to the operation. What they did is they closed down the use of this area as a machine shop and converted it to a restaurant and bar. It was called Bosacki's Grill and Sandwich Shop. So there was an ad for it in 1929. Interesting menu for a grill and sandwich shop. Quite a complete menu. Then in 1930, Bosacki did extensive remodeling of the boathouse. Now remember, in 1930, Anthony left and bought the Pleasant View. And in 1930, Theodore Bosacki then did extensive remodeling to better accommodate the sweet shop that was being operated and the restaurant and bar. Now in 1931, the town built a bandstand. This is Highway 51 here, or the south end of Oneida Street. And so between Oneida Street and the lake, there was a bandstand. Bosacki's is off to the right here. And there were weekly concerts given there by the Island City Band. And in 1932, there was a push by the residents of the town and the town board itself to fix up this area as a park to better accommodate the concerts that were being held there. But in doing that, a controversy arose between the town and Theodore Bosacki about the ownership of the property behind Bosacki's. how much did the town control and what did Bosacki control? And at that time, apparently, Theodore Bosacki was irritated enough by the sentiment by the people, some people who had a sentiment against him, against his claim to some ownership. And so he then posted this offer to sell. This was in the newspaper on June 17, 1932. And he offered to sell the boathouse to the town for $4,000. That was not followed through. The town did not follow through with that. It obviously was not purchased. So he retained it, and in later years they did settle what part of this land back here is owned by Bosackis and what part by the town. So we're looking at what I call the rear of the boathouse. Here is a well, this was a houseboat, but it was built based on an old railroad car that was put on a raft. So this was the one that Clum and Petter had, this houseboat for rent. And this is before the sweet shop was started. The machine shop is here. This is what Clum and Petter started, this machine shop on that side. That's where the bar and restaurant eventually would be. So here's a picture from a little different angle, clearly showing the machine shop. Here's a little later, 1936. Now it shows the sweet shop there and the conversion of the machine shop to a restaurant and bar. This is the only interior picture I've ever seen of the old Bosackis. This is the sweet shop, but I would love to see some old pictures taken in that in the bar and restaurant that were back here, but I've never seen any. This is about 1945. Again, you advertising good food there and a sweet shop there. About 1950. Now in this picture you can see here the tackle shop off to the right, to the north side of Bosackis. Now that building was built in 1929 by David Josart, because that building is in front of David Josart's residence. And so he built it on his lakefront. Contrary to the legal findings more recently, well, actually, I shouldn't say more recently. It was contrary to the legal findings that were decided in a Wisconsin Supreme Court case, that all the land between Park Avenue, both West and East Park Avenue, and the lakefront was owned by the town. Yet back then, nobody was enforcing that, and Dave Josart built this shop in front of his house. And he rented it out for years. Eventually it was purchased by Bosacki, I believe in 1960. But until then, it was rented out. And these photos, about 1940, were when it was being rented or operated by Joe Connelly. He operated a marine repair business there. And after he did that from 39 to about 48, and then Ed Engelhorn operated in that building. And that's a name maybe some of you would recognize, because he did operate into the 50s, and he was very active with the Minocqua Bats. He was a driver for them, drove their ski boat. So here's a aerial photograph about 1950 that shows you that tackle shop in relation to the Bosackis boathouse. Gives you a good view of what that area, and this is that park area and the parking lot. This is the area that was in dispute back in the early 30s. By this time, by 1950, the bandstand was no longer there. Another aerial photo just doesn't show Bosacki's that much, just an interesting one. Shows the entrance of Highway 51 into Minocqua at that time, about 55. The Lakeview Motel there. And the little cabins here, the little Minocqua cabins. So here's what I was referring to, that into the 50s, that launch called Minocqua was being used. They were advertising daily excursion trips on Launch Minocqua. And this is also a 1950 ad, and here's where this confirms my conclusion in reviewing the contemporaneous records back in the from 1915 to 1920, that Bosacki started operating a candy shop, or actually first a ice cream shop, in 1919, and this ad run in 1950 confirms that recollection by Harlan and Tilly Bosacki, that they started there in 1919. And at this time, Theodore Bosacki's wife, or widow, Augusta Bosacki, was still working in the kitchen. She was famous for her homemade pies. Here's a picture from probably 1951. Pete Abraham in this Aquabats boat, Minocqua-Bats, with just showed a good picture of the boathouse in the background. Yeah, it looked like he couldn't get it started. 1953 ad. Didn't say anything about excursion boat rides, but they were selling speedboat rides at Bosacki's. Then Harlan, who was the son of Theodore, Harlan was second generation Bosacki. He died in May of 1959. Now, at that time, Larry Bosacki was probably just getting out of the service, because here's a picture of him in 55 about him going through basic training, infantry training in the U.S. Army. Presumably he was in the service for 4 years, so would have been getting out in 59, which happened to coincide with when his father died. So he had been working, of course, before going into the service, he had been working at the boathouse, but then getting out of the service, and with the death of his father, he and his mother, Tilly, became the owners of the boathouse, and the two of them were in charge of operating it. 1960 ad, all you can eat fish fry for $1.25. 1964, the price had gone up to $1.50 for that fish fry, but you could get trout, pike, shrimp, or scallops. Now, I may be misreading that. It could be that those aren't all included in the fish fry. That may not be true. But a barbecue rib dinner was only $2.50. Interesting picture of the Minocqua-Bats. Guessing about 1962. It's before the 1965 bridge rebuild. Included it because it's a good view of Bosacki's boathouse and the tackle shop. In 1965, Bosacki's became a dealer for snowmobile. And things were starting in the 60s, but we didn't have trails up here till the early 70s. And so, you know, the sleds, the snowmobiles weren't bringing that many people up here until about 1970, when things got more organized. We started to get snowmobile trails, and then it made an impact on our winter business. 1965, this is when the new bridge was built, and the Highway 51 approach into Minocqua was straightened out. So this would be, like it is now, a straight shot. That's 65. That bridge opened at the end of May in 66. And there it is, completed. This picture about 67. It looks like an idyllic place back then. And then 1972 happened, July 22, Saturday, July 22. The fire at Bosacki's. As described in the Lakeland Times, I'll have to get to that. Harlan Bosacki, who was only, I think, 14 years old at that time. Yeah, he was 14. He was fueling a boat near the pumps, and gas spilled into the bottom of the boat. It overflowed the fill, and the bilge pump turned on to drain the bilge, and there was a spark, and it exploded. And so Harlan had second-degree burns on his arm. He almost extinguished the fire with a fire extinguisher, but it was a windy day, and a gust of wind blew the fire into the adjoining boathouse, and so it spread. The fire department came. I think Larry, I don't know if at that time he was already chief of the volunteer fire department. At one point, Larry was the chief for many years of Minocqua Volunteer Fire Department. But they came, and they too were almost able to extinguish the blaze, but the wind outdid their efforts. And the wind spread the fire into the restaurant and bar, and then it was all done. And within an hour, this picture, and we'll look at that on a bigger scale. Within an hour, the whole boathouse was burned down. They were able to save the tackle shop. The siding on this side was burned, but they were able to save the tackle shop. It didn't burn, but the rest of the boathouse did, right down to the base. So the tackle shop was saved. There was a lot of help emptying things from the tackle shop, because the expectation was that was going to go too. And it was too late to empty much of anything from the boathouse, because that went so quickly. But there was an effort then to remove boats and equipment and inventory from the tackle shop. And lots of people helped with that. And that's what it looked like the next day. This is probably a few days afterwards, because this is a pile of debris that they've been taking out here to be trucked away. So this isn't the next day, but it's, maybe a week later. Here's that pile of debris that they're taking out. Here you can see that they're working on, they already replaced siding here. They're working on fixing roof. Some of these weren't taken with very good cameras. This one, actually, I think this one came from a Rhinelander newspaper. I received it from a guy in Rhinelander. Shows a pretty good view of shortly after the fire, because none of that debris is cleaned out and piled here. Within a week after the fire, they got a gas pump up and operating on the dock, so they could at least start selling gas. And Irv Bratz, right here, Irv Bratz was their first customer. This is Tom Butters, Dick Vorse, and Dick Quady. They were employees at Bosacki's. And then the tackle shop at Bosacki's was also back in operation by a week after the fire. So I should back up prior to this approval. This was a big issue because Bosacki's was built over the lake. So rebuilding was a big issue. Certainly you got away with that back in 1910 and 1920, but you didn't in 1972. There was a firm stance by the state. They would not allow anybody to build anything out over a lake because the state owns the lake bottom, and so that's why you can't build wet boathouses anymore. So we had Bosacki's was facing the problem that, first of all, they couldn't rebuild over the lake, but they were also facing the issue of a 75-foot setback, which was written in state law, setback from the waterfront, and in county zoning. So with a 75-foot setback, there wouldn't have been any place left to rebuild the boathouse. There was a huge outpouring by people. Let me back up to the page that showed. Don't want to have to go back that far, but it's cumbersome. There. So right here, there was an editorial to sign the petition to allow. It was a petition to the state and county to allow Bosacki to rebuild. It was very quickly determined or realized that he wasn't going to be allowed to rebuild over the water. But it turned into, how do we get to rebuild from the shoreline, starting up to, from the shoreline back. And the town helped a lot in that, because in the state law, there was a provision that if a municipality establishes a bulkhead along a waterfront, and if the municipality gives permit to build up to that bulkhead, the person can do it. And despite that would be in spite of the state law that says you have to be 75 feet back. The Minocqua Town Board acted quickly to establish a bulkhead. And they, in fact, established a very favorable bulkhead. They probably stretched things quite a bit because they actually extended the shoreline out from, based on where the shoreline is, to the north and to the backside of the tackle shop, then it suddenly juts out. The bulkhead that they established juts out there and then goes southeast along the shore to give more room to rebuild the building. And so they were very cooperative in that respect. They established the bulkhead. The county zoning gave a exemption. They didn't require the building to be 75 feet back. That was perhaps in large part to the outpouring of support by people. And the outpouring of support by people was probably because Bosacki's was such a community institution back then. Very, very much so for people who lived in the community and all visitors in the community. And another big part of this was Larry Bosacki. He was a very friendly, very community-involved person. And he made friends with all his customers. So when you came into Bosacki's and sat at the bar and talked with Larry, you went away feeling that Larry was a friend of yours and you were a friend of his. And so he had a lot of support, and that's why they got to rebuild. I've talked to people about what would happen if Thirsty Whale burned. Now, I don't think we'd have the same outcome. So let's get back to where we were here. So by the end of August, Bosacki had state and county approval. That was fast. I mean, this happened. The fire was on July 22nd, I think I said, or July 20th, July 22nd. By the end of August, he had all the approvals to proceed, and he was working with Ron Edwards and Associates as the architects to design the new boathouse. And then in November, construction started, November of '72. And this picture is in May when construction was well underway, and they still hope to be in it by July. There's a picture of Larry and his mother Tilly. They both look tired to me, and they had a tiring year. So here's a picture of Bosacki's in July. They did not get open. Their goal had been to be open in July of '73. They didn't hit that goal. And here's a picture in late August. They're getting close, but the building still wasn't done, late August. And they ran an ad on September 20 that Bosacki's tap room is now open. So they opened up mid-September of '73. This is a little blurry for two reasons. First of all, it's a lithographic print. It's not a photographic print off a postcard, on a postcard, but it's also cropped to show just this part of it. Again, a more updated picture, 1988, after the new boathouse was built. They were able to put the docks back in. The state allowed that. But they did, I think, they could only put the docks in where they were before, where there were pilings before. And so they were able to do docks based on the old pilings. Then the bad times. Well, after, in the 1990s, here's where I should have the Bosacki children talk. By the late 1890s, Larry had kind of turned over operation to his daughters, and they were doing a great job. They were doing an excellent job operating Bosacki's boathouse, with Kathy behind the bar and Sherry operating the restaurant and Laurie doing the bookkeeping. I don't know what Harlan was doing. Might not have been involved at that point. But then in late around 2000, early 2000s, Larry decided to turn the boathouse over to Harlan. And things started going bad after that. And so by 2008, Bosacki's was in foreclosure. And there was going to be a sheriff's sale in 2009. There was a foreclosure judgment in 2008. And in 2009, there was going to be a sheriff's sale. Harlan filed bankruptcy to stop the sheriff's sale. But then by May 5th, the creditor, which was Northwoods Equity Investments, got approval from the bankruptcy court to release the property from the bankruptcy stay and continue with the sheriff's sale, which was held on May 5th. And Equity Investments was the only bidder at that sheriff's sale, and then that sale was confirmed, and then they sold the property to the owner of Matt Morgan's, and that opened November 15 of 2010, later that year. And it became Matt Morgan's on the Lake. And Matt Morgan's on the Lake only lasted about 2 years, and they closed in the winter of 2012, 2013. And then in early 2013, the Rushmeyers took over operation of it. And they opened in May of 2013. It was Rushmeyers and Bill Fricke was managing the bar for them, and they managed the restaurant. So this is a picture of the buildings in September of 2025 when the Rushmeyers were still operating it as, well, not the Rushmeyers, because there were similar or subsequent operators that took over, but it was called the Boathouse. The Rushmeyers changed the name to the Boathouse in 2013, and it was still being operated as the Boathouse in 2025, and it closed October 31 of 2025 because the plan is to tear this all down and rebuild a new restaurant. But we haven't seen the tear down yet, and that's probably because they're running into some difficulties perhaps on getting all the permits that they need to build what they want there. So that brings us to the current situation. We're waiting for the old Bosackis or the old boathouse to be torn down and a new building to be built. So, any questions? Or in the case of Sherry and Kathy, maybe some corrections. Did anybody have any questions? I don't know. I only know the history. I know what was past. I don't know the future. You don't even know the current. Yeah. Okay. Yes. He did. September of 25. Well, I skipped that part. I missed that in my notes. I skipped that part. I was supposed to describe that Richard Wasserberger died in September of 25, died suddenly of a heart attack. Actually, it was in his buddy's office, his buddy being Bert Bassett, B.O. Bassett, in the Ford garage. And he died in the Ford garage. Yes, there was a probate, but there would have been, with or without a will, there would have been a probate. But with a will, perhaps he would have left it all to his wife instead of having the children involved. That would have been the difference. But Bosacki then purchased the boathouse from Wasserberger's estate, and he bought it definitely by July 1 of 1926. It was Bosacki's, at least by that date, if not earlier. Yes.
I was just curious, since when the boathouse burnt down, like doing the water, any boats, or there was a lot of boats that did go down. A lot of them were saying people were pushing them out and swimming with them, but I'm not going to think of dive guy going around cleaning the rivers. Down there, as the diver had pulled out several bullets this spring or this late early summer from down there because everything that went down stayed down.
There was an article in 1972 about a diver who was inspecting the pilings of Joe's Marine Bar for the change of ownership to become the Thirsty Whale. And while he was inspecting the pilings, he found a boat down there, a 20-foot long boat made by Rhinelander Boat Company that had an inboard engine in it that was valuable. And he did salvage the engine from the boat. The boat itself wasn't salvageable, but he brought up the engine. It was a 4-cylinder Morton inboard engine. Yes.
had to have been changed at some time because you have a dam on the dam lake. Was that changed before all the development started?
Yes. The dam was built in 1889. The town of Minocqua, the village was settled in the beginning in December and January of 87, 88. In 1889, the dam was built, and it took about 2 or 3 years, at least 2 or 3 years, for the flowage to fill up to its current level, because the dam raised the level of the lake. It was reported back then as 5 feet, raised the level. Any other questions? No?
So I happened to be up here the day that the place burned.
Oh, really?
I didn't go see it the day, but and going by it on the way home there, where the boats had a piece of chrome going down the front of it, that would be sticking out of the water, and that was it. It was just
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm probably getting close. Well, it's 6:45. We're getting close to closing, yes. And what is the question about Hoover? I don't think so. Yeah, there was no confirmation that he actually was holding a revolver at the time of the shooting, because there was nothing in the coroner's inquest or the trial that indicated that. I don't see any other hands, so maybe we're done. Thank you.